God also proves himself through history. He does so by way of fulfilled prophecy. Now we're going to touch mainly upon two, although there are many, many examples in the Bible that prove God's supernatural ability to predict the future. And if you want to do a little research on your own, I would highly recommend Josh McDowell's book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. I believe that this book should be in every Christian's household. It's filled with answers to the questions that many of us get all the time as Christians, and we simply need to know how to answer these questions. Now, in Isaiah 48, it says, I have declared the former things from the beginning. They went forth from my mouth, and I caused them to hear it. Suddenly I did them, and they came to pass, because I knew that you were obstinate. Even from the beginning, I have declared it to you. Before it came to pass, I proclaimed it to you. God tells us the end from the beginning. He does that partly because he wants to show the doubting Thomases of the world that he is who he says he is. The prophecy in the book of Ezekiel is one of the most definitive proofs of the supernatural origin and message of the Bible due to the massive historical and archaeological evidence that supports it. The ancient city of Tyre was a Phoenician port city located on the southern coast of modern-day Lebanon. This city and its people are mentioned in numerous places in the Bible, and much of what we know about the city and its history is a result of those biblical references that pointed latter-day archaeologists to the exact locations and events described in Scripture. Between 970 and 930 BC, Hiram, the king of Tyre, was a friend of King Solomon, and he even provided the cedar for Solomon's temple. But 400 years later, the city had become the virtual capital of the idolatrous and pagan Canaanite culture, and they were dragging Israel down with them. Thus God, through the prophet Ezekiel, promises the eradication of this most famous seaport of ancient times. A simple reading of Ezekiel 26, 1 through 14, reveals 6 specific predictions made in this text. First, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon would destroy the mainland city of Tyre. Second, many nations would rise up against Tyre. These nations would come like waves of the sea, one after another. Third, Tyre would be made like a flat rock. Fourth, fishermen will dry their nets there. Fifth, the ruins of the city would be cast into the sea. Sixth, Tyre would never be rebuilt. Now let's look at the actual history of Tyre from this point. Notice that the prophecy is fulfilled in stages by various nations and enemies over a period of roughly 1,800 years. The first fulfillment occurred just a few years after Ezekiel penned this prophecy, when King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon laid siege against the city beginning in 585 BC. But by the time he finally broke down the gates, he found that the people of Tyre had moved all their possessions by ship to an island a half-mile offshore. Even though Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed the mainland city, fulfilling Ezekiel 26:8, the new city offshore continued to flourish for nearly 250 years. But the prophecy of Ezekiel 26:12 says that their enemies will break down your walls and demolish your fine houses and throw your stones, timber, and rubble into the sea. And this portion remained unfulfilled until 332 BC, when Alexander the Great performed a virtual military miracle to overcome the city. Writing about 400 years after this event, a Greek historian by the name of Arrian detailed this feat in his writing titled The Campaigns of Alexander. His description of the fortification of the island of Tyre resembles that of Alcatraz, because the city sat offshore like a rock, with walls that came down to the edge of the water and seemed impenetrable. But Alexander devised a brilliant plan to build a land bridge or causeway to the island by having his soldiers throw the ruins from the original city that Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed into the water, and then leveling off the new causeway as they went so that they could march across it and directly assault Tyre and its walls. However, the people within the city and the Tyrian navy on the sea constantly attacked Alexander's men as they worked on the causeway. So Alexander, realizing that he needed ships of his own to help defend his soldiers, returned to the cities that he had conquered beforehand and demanded their assistance. Thus, the prophecy that God will cause many nations to come up against you, as the sea causes its waves to come up, was fulfilled in even greater detail. Alexander succeeded in his plan. It took him just 7 months to conquer Tyre, and in the end, 8,000 people were slain and 30,000 were sold into slavery. And the causeway he built can still be seen to this day. Historian Philip Myers said, Alexander the Great reduced Tyre to ruins. The city recovered partly from this blow, but never regained its prominence in the world. The larger part of the site is now as bare as the top of a rock, a place where the fishermen spread their nets to dry. In time, the island city was again repopulated, only to be leveled again in 1281 AD by the Muslims. However, Ezekiel had prophesied that the powerful mainland city would never be rebuilt, and it never has been. There have been many cities throughout history that have been destroyed and rebuilt, but not Tyre. Even though it's in a perfect location for the commerce of a large city, and it has several natural springs that could supply a huge population with water. But it will never be rebuilt, because the Lord proclaimed over 25 centuries ago, "You shall be built no more."